Hello everyone, and welcome to this latest video discussion as part of the RICS Tech Partner Program. My name is Andrew Knight and I have been with RICS for nearly 12 years now, and I sit within the thought leadership and analytics part of the organisation with my role looking at the whole impact of data and technology right across the built and national environment, and with over 110,000 qualified members working worldwide right across that property life cycle through land, planning and development, construction, valuation, brokerage, finance, building operation and end of life. There's clearly a very huge broad canvas upon which data and technology is having a very profound and positive effect. And indeed, our members also work across a whole variety of asset types. In addition to land itself, they work with residential, commercial, alternative property, infrastructure. So once again, huge palette upon which data and technology is having a very profound effect. And today I'm really pleased to have Caleb join me from Pantera. So please do join me, Caleb.
Thanks, Andrew, for having me. Happy to be here.
Pleasure. Great to have you on the call. Now, before we get into the bits and bytes or any kind of level of technology, it's always nice to kind of get a bit of a human angle here. And it'd be great to hear a bit about your backstory and the kind of origin story of Pantera.
Sure thing. So a bit of background on myself. I've worked a majority of my career in PropTech. Doesn't seem that I've been able to escape it so far, actually. But the majority of my previous roles have been developing softwares to help landlords, managing agents just understand their portfolio performance a lot better. So benchmarking things like rent collection, lease lengths against market benchmarks, so like-for-like properties, like-for-like locations and regions. So it kind of thrust me into the world of family offices, propcos, managing agents all around the country, really. And I think managed to ride the coattails of COVID, where it really increased people's appetite to get more insight and information on their portfolios, which has kind of led to the genesis of what is Pantera. So yeah, it's really just as a result of seeing where there were gaps and missing jigsaw puzzles in the overall makeup of people looking at their portfolios.
Now, you've mentioned some of the kind of issues you've been looking at, and I'm always very conscious that perhaps one of the things that could be criticised in the PropTech Centre is kind of developing technology for the sake of technology, because technology is not an end in itself, it's a means to an end in terms of problem solving. So how would you kind of summarise the kind of problems that you're looking to solve at Pantera?
I think we've got three key sort of issues that we look to help. So for a bit of context, Pantera is very focused on the ability to give forecasting analysis and predictions around sort of what's going to happen to your portfolio over the next little while. And what we sort of saw was that a lot of funds, propcos, agents were doing this kind of analysis, but on Excel, back of the envelope, in conversation in an investment committee or something along those lines. So the first issue that we look to really help and alleviate is the fact that forecasting many different scenarios and future outcomes is pretty burdensome. I think we spoke to a senior analyst at one of the big top tier agents just yesterday, and they spent 2 days uploading information into an Excel spreadsheet for them to allow to just get the basis of their forecasting for the quarter ahead. So I think you're right, there is a lot of technology probably out there for the sake of technology, and Excel has worked up until a point, but I think with people's knowledge and appetite for modern softwares, I think it's a really nice entry point for us to give some efficiencies there and help people along the way.
And I suppose it's become a bit of a cliche to talk about the fact that obviously PropTech has brought, in I would say, a positive sense of disruption and innovation. But when you look at kind of other industries' approach to this kind of analytics and predictive, tools, what other sort of sectors and industries have you drawn inspiration from when looking at arguably similar kinds of problems, albeit with a different kind of data set and a different kind of assets when you look at real estate?
I think so. One in particular, again, for a little bit of context, here at Pantera, we sort of allow analysts and portfolio managers to skip a lot of the legwork when it comes to creating forecasts and a lot of that sort of foundational level data input. One of the industries that we've really drawn inspiration from and has actually helped us create the tech stack that we have today is what we saw in the no-code movement. And I don't know whether you're familiar with that, Andrew, but it's essentially sort of this movement to allow probably non-technical people or people with some sort of technical skills, but perhaps not in the weeds coders, to build software applications and build technology products, to get their first few clients on board, to test ideas. And we sort of looked at that and thought, there are softwares out there which know their positioning in the market. They know the value that they can give, but it allows probably the non-technical side of the community to to save money, to save cost, to save resources, and attack problems themselves. So I think that's how we started and tested our first few prototypes of Pantera, and I think that sort of really paved the way for us to be the no code of forecasting, really.
Is that your tagline, the no code of forecasting?
I think we do try to avoid to be the Uber or the Airbnb of something, but if we were having to choose one, I would say that's probably the closest one.
So in terms of the origin of Pantera and the ways you've grown, I know you're part of the Geovation accelerator in the UK. Could you tell us a bit about that for people who are not familiar? Obviously, some people in the UK maybe, but outside of the UK, they probably won't have heard of it. A bit of background on how you're finding that program?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the Geovation program is an awesome accelerator which has given us some office space. You can see I'm in a real life office right now, people moving in and out of the background. But it's most importantly backed by the HM Land Registry and also the Ordnance Survey. So it is an accelerator which is founded in property and property data more specifically. So I think that's probably been one of the biggest draw cards for us is to have an organization which is well aligned. They get our idea off the bat. They understand that there are inefficiencies and more importantly opportunities to take property data and put it in the hands of landlords and managing agents and portfolio managers and whoever else needs it to make decisions quicker, faster, and any other sort of adjectives you want to throw out really. So it's been an awesome first couple of months in Accelerator, surrounded by some of the pretty cool PropTech and geotech companies.
And I suppose that once again, that kind of network effect of working with like-minded people in the same kind of setting and having perhaps similar aims to some extent, but different in terms of the actual outcomes that you're looking to move with. What sort of data has been really useful? Because as you say, having access to that Ordnance Survey and Land Registry data is very powerful. What have been the particular pieces of their data sets that have really helped you?
Yeah, so what we're looking most closely at is it's a lot around sort of the purchase information of properties around the country. So, landlords and portfolio managers have got a pretty good idea of what they paid for a property and when they purchased it. Although we do have several examples with portfolio managers that have lost that information. But I think what we see the opportunity being is how can we sort of really bring in not market comps, but sort of other surrounding data to help inform what kind of purchase that you did engage in or that you might look to engage in the future, and how that might stack up as you start to blend those acquisition scenarios into your own portfolio, so that you're not having to go and do lots of legwork to get sort of particulars for any listings out there from agents or anything else, and really starting to pool in that information and see it side by side against your own current holdings and portfolio.
So almost leading on from that, I suppose, well, how would you describe the kind of your kind of unique differentiated approach to helping people develop these strategies? Because clearly you've got access to a whole bunch of data, and obviously the next important layer is that analytical piece on top to answer various questions. So how are you kind of approaching this problem in a way that you think will differentiate you?
Probably in one word, visual. I think a lot of perhaps not prop tech, but the way that financial forecasting has been done is columns and rows and cells and formulas. And I think those are really important fundamentals, and we haven't binned them off completely. But I think the mechanisms that we're using to allow people to really quickly create forecasts and really quickly see the impact of certain decisions is in short visual. And I can perhaps show you an example in a moment's time. But I think the power for an agent to show their client a visualization of their plans going forward, or a landlord to understand the impact of a tenant going bust or a capex project in 6 months' time. Yes, seeing the numbers in a month, in a year is helpful, but bring everything together in a visual picture to see how certain floors and units may interact and impact others in a property has really been a large cornerstone for how we operate. Because as a founding team, we're using modern tech all the time to manage deal pipelines, talk to customers, talk to prospects, manage our own product roadmap, and we're really just trying to bring that kind of thinking, that kind of design into the world of real estate.
And I suppose, ironically, real estate is a real asset. It's something that historically agents and portfolio managers would go and look at the location. So it is a visual asset, despite all the underlying numbers and DCFs and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, so you mentioned you could give us some kind of visual idea of what the visualization looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. I will bring it up here. Does that come up for you, Andrew?
Yeah.
Well, so as we sort of mentioned before, Pantera is being used to create forecasts and scenarios for people's current portfolios, but we also are able to bring in potential acquisitions and disposal scenarios, which I'll be able to run through in a moment. But
Okay.
Pantera has got sort of the ability to integrate to property management systems or to asset management systems, so that you've got a record of your current holdings and you can see my assets here. But the real USP, or the novel piece, is again that visualization of the plans going forward. So if I jump into another tab here, you'll see that I've got a potential acquisition scenario here with some details around a target IRR and a particular hold period. And what we have here is a visualization of a building or of a scenario that I've got into the future. Down the left hand side, I've got units 1 through to 4, and if I hover over the different blocks and different units, I can start to see the information about the occupiers in that space, what they pay for rent, what their lease details are, etc. And through color coding, through visuals, we can see where our voids are currently planned for. We can see capex projects, rent concessions, and the other sort of really key lease events, which will probably change the outcome of an investment or the profile of a return as well. And the idea is that as an asset manager or portfolio manager, I can interact with each of these elements, changing our expected uplift on rent reviews, extending out our incentive periods, whatever that might be, so that I can get a real sense for my future looking assumptions, what's going to be the end result. And again, those results are very visual, whether it's looking at our cash on cash yield profile or sensitivity for purchase price to IRR, all the investment metrics that guide decision making, but can typically be pretty cumbersome and pretty difficult to get to for multiple scenarios.
So as you say, it's essentially when you go back to that previous view, a color-coded set of lease events, as you say, spanning across different units, different floors, in, as you say, certainly a format I've not seen, because one is so used to seeing this in a kind of an Excel or other kind of format, rather than actually visualizing a building or a unit in this way.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. So, I mean, I'll just, for demonstration's sake, just extend that void to 3 to 12 months, for example, and you'll be able to see how quickly that sort of changes in front of me, so that if I am in front of a client or an investment committee type style meeting, changing those assumptions on the fly, and obviously the resulting cash flow, which is sort of the engine behind all of this, is super simple and is really intuitive. But it's funny that you mentioned, and I might just stop sharing my screen really quickly, that it's not something that you've seen before. And I think seeing it online is absolutely correct. It's a novel approach. It's something different. But we've had quite a few calls now where we bring that up on screen, and the portfolio manager or asset manager that we're speaking to will slowly bring up their A4 bit of paper which they were scribbling on before the call, and that's how a lot of people are planning out, and just for their own sanity. They're drawing timelines either in a color-coded Excel file or on paper. So I think the concept and the familiarity isn't abnormal, but I think bringing it into a environment like this, where it is tied to financials, it is tied to the investment principles of a building, is probably the unique approach.
I suppose it's funny, isn't it? Because you say, we'd all be very familiar with sitting down with a copy of Microsoft Project with various timelines and looking at that dimension so naturally, and looking at multiple lines on a project and just being very familiar with that kind of laying out. But we've always seen these kind of lease events almost as, I suppose perhaps it goes back to the concept of having a written lease and these being, documents that have only just, in many cases, been turned into structured data that now enable us to visualize them as well, because it's very hard to turn a series of written leases into a spreadsheet, let alone turn it into a visual representation like that. So you mentioned in particular also that people are looking at not just for kind of managing an existing asset, but also kind of scenario planning around actually investment as well. So is that another use case that people are using it for, to play around with this idea of, well, what if we actually, moved on, spent so much money on refit, got people in, new occupiers in at a higher market rent. I suppose that kind of almost what if scenario, I suppose, is another way of using this.
Absolutely, the what if scenario is a crucial element of it, and so I think there are softwares out there or sort of legacy systems, whether that be Excel or something else, which can give you a relatively good sense for what the outcome might be. But I think you start to run into the issue of scalability. So if I take one scenario or what if thing over here, I take another over there, what's the overall impact on my portfolio? What's my global loan to value ratio, or my global debt covenant piece as well? So I think the ability to really synthesize that information and consolidate it, again, is I'm probably preaching to the choir, just another benefit of that sort of scalable technology play. So I think that's sort of where we're going to really see the benefits, as well as you start to really layer in those different scenarios into each other.
I mean, as you've worked to develop this and talk to people and experiment, if I can use that phrase, what have you learned that you didn't know at the beginning? What sort of things have you actually sort of perhaps done differently, or been able to implement that perhaps hadn't come up before you really started testing it in anger and using it in anger, as it were?
I think probably one of the key learnings for us, and something which we are sort of really pushing to the front of our own product roadmap, is just how we can help asset management and a little bit of investment management, but probably mostly asset management, to be as proactive as possible as opposed to reactive. And I think asset managers probably get a hard time. You've got clients in one ear and tenants in the other, and occupiers in the other, and you are fighting fires a lot of the time. We work really closely with portfolio and asset managers, so we're really looking at tooling, which is sort of bringing information to an asset manager rather than you having to go and seek it out. And what I showed you there before is playing around with the things that like your sense of whether someone's going to renew, your sense of the market rate or the market rent, because that's what you had at the pub last night, or whatever it might be. But I think things like bringing in occupier news, relevant occupier news. So if you've got WH Smith in 10 of your demises, what were their trading results? Is that going to affect your assumptions around their longevity? And I don't want to pick on WH Smith. But anyone else?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I think that's probably one example of how we are starting to really reframe the conversation in our mind, and probably start to shape our own mission and vision, because we started off as a forecasting software, but I think it's probably trying to allow that asset and investment management just to be on the front foot as much as possible, and obviously mitigate the many risks that exist.
And in terms of your engagement with the market, because I'm also very, it becomes a cliche again that so much of what PropTech can do almost has to be built hand in hand with the marketplace. What's your been experience of talking to the different kind of asset managers, the different kind of stakeholders that you obviously want to get in front of? What's their sort of feedback been effectively in terms of what they're seeing, what they're asking you for, the kind of validation of what you've already managed to build?
For sure, I think there's probably two camps which I could probably identify. One being where this kind of practice, forecasting and scenario planning, is commonplace. There are analysts that do this at the top tier agencies and the top tier funds at the moment, and I think in some of those firms you're pushing against an open door, because they're aware of the shortfalls and the pitfalls and some of the processes which they've got at the moment. Of course, you're always going to come across people which are pretty happy with the status quo, and that's a different conversation. But I think the other camp are the firms which are doing this in a very limited extent. They're doing some models around tenant re-gears and tenant releasing or acquisition and disposals, but they haven't had the time or the resource to really stress test a lot of those assumptions and stress test the different options that are available to them, and that it can fail to highlight gaps in cash flow, gaps in sort of going concern. Are we going to be around to pay the mortgage and pay the bills? So I think that's another camp which has been really interesting for us to get in front of, is how can we give the tools and empower those types of portfolio managers, something which they weren't really being afforded in the past as well. So that's been an exciting conversation to have, and developing a tool with them where it is very much a blank sheet of paper, as opposed to perhaps the other camp where there are obviously ideas and concepts which have worked well in the past and we want to iterate and improve on. So I think it's been a really nice blend of complete fresh-eyed, bushy-tailed type approach, and using some of the legacy knowledge that it already exists, and sort of smashing them together to create what we have now.
Indeed. And I suppose with the current economic situation, that there's even more focus on managing existing portfolios, understanding disposals, acquisitions, as you've mentioned, because with yields moving out, there's additional pressure to look at how assets are performing, and unfortunately, as you say, an economic background where you need to be looking at covenant strength and all those issues and the trajectory of rent. So these kind of what ifs, I think, are even more important now, aren't they?
They are indeed. I think that's a general consensus as well, is that perhaps there's not as many investment deals happening today in the current climate, but what a lot of the focus is being turned to is how can we make sure our portfolio keeps running in the background and we are squeezing the assets for as much as we can right now, and controlling the controllables. So I think hopefully that's a tailwind we can also use and leverage as we start to work with more funds and more clients as well.
And are you hearing anything around the kind of, the you could use, one could use the word pressure around ESG and sustainability, and the fact that obviously people are having to look at potential sort of retrofit costs, kind of more operational costs they might have to put in that they can't recover through service charges, for example, to make sure their portfolio is kind of resilient, that they're going to not be looking at any kind of brown haircut or sort of stranded assets, and how that's going to once again be these kind of what if discussions of what kind of rents could we achieve if we did this kind of refit type expense, or expense that's going to in a good way improve the performance. Are you seeing that coming through as a set of data points that's driving these kind of scenario plans?
Absolutely. I think it's definitely increasing the desire to do more stress testing of future looking plans. I think the example we had earlier this week was a family office looking at putting solar panels on almost every single one of their buildings, not only because they think it's going to increase the investment value, or at least that's what they told me, but because it was the right thing to do for them and their occupiers. So I think for them to validate how to tranche that project or to stage that project against sort of voids and occupied periods where they were going to have the funds and have the capital to engage in that project. You can imagine as your portfolio swells and the numbers increase, trying to conceptualize how you plan out those different expenditure projects can become quite tough, and the more scenarios you do, the longer time it takes, and that's something that we can hopefully drive some efficiency for. But you're absolutely right. I think the increased focus on the ESG side is increasing the number of different scenarios which are being put into portfolio strategies.
Indeed. Well, it's been fascinating to talk, and I look forward to catching up again probably next year when we get a bit of an update on how things are going. But it's been fascinating, and I think visualization is so key in so many PropTech products, really, isn't it? Bringing to life information in a way that actually people can access and make decisions on in a much more familiar way that, as you say, we do in almost every other walk of life in many respects.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I've really enjoyed the chat, so yeah, thanks for having me on.
Pleasure. Good. Look forward to catching up again.
Cool. Thanks, Andrew.